Welcome back to On the Move with Victor Shi. This is Victor Shi. It is Wednesday, May 3rd, and today we're going to talk about the threats facing our national security, in particular, that which comes from the right and even Donald Trump himself. How big of a threat do they pose? Will it get worse or will it get better? And what steps should all of us be taking in order to mitigate those threats? Joining me to discuss all of this, my good friend Miles Taylor, who is a former national security official, author of A Warning, and soon to be author of a book that will be coming out over the summer on July 18th called Blowback, A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump. Miles, it's so great to see you. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, my friend, great to be with you, and greetings from a cab in New York City. So we're
Love
gonna
it.
have a fun time here on the road today.
Yes, we will. Well, let's talk about the national security threat facing our nation. And to the best of my knowledge, I think there was once a time that when we talked about a threat facing our national security, it usually meant a threat from another nation or country. But it seems like that is increasingly coming from within, whether it's something like January 6th or another lone wolf incidents. And I want to start by asking you, what marked that shift from an outside adversary posing a threat to something coming from within?
Well, look, I think it's easy to say, that it was Donald Trump, but the more nuanced answer is the moment in which a plurality of people started to feel like the system itself wasn't representing their views and that they had to go around the system. So, what do I mean by that? In most of my career, like you noted, I've focused on foreign threats and not domestic threats, and especially extremism that motivates individuals to join violent extremist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. And what you see with a lot of those violent extremist movements is they start off as political movements and they start off as a demand for some kind of radical change in the system, which leads to conspiracy theories and disinformation about the system itself. And results in followers being convinced that there's no point in engaging civilly through the political process and that they have to go around the system and even attack the system itself and undermine it with violence, which is what we've seen with conspiracy theory movements like QAnon, like the Great Replacement Theory, like the big lie about the stolen election. These civic myths are the type of thing that radicalize people to violence. And we're seeing that here in the United States. And again, around the time of Donald Trump's rise, we saw a lot of these civic myths starting to take hold in different ways. And that has created the fertile soil, if you will, for violent extremism in the United States.
Yeah. I want to ask you about Trump and kind of how do you think he's able to get people to not only listen to him and believe him, but to also act on it, and in some cases actually use violence? Like what is it in Trump's words or rhetoric that gets people to kind of do stuff that is just so dangerous and violent?
Well, it's the otherism uh, that he foments, and the best way to get a sense of how bad this is just to go look at the data. The majority right now of Americans that have strong political views, either on the left or the right, no longer view the other side as the opposition. They now view the other side as the enemy. And Pew has done some really good research on this front. And what Donald Trump has done is he's really weaponized that and said, if the other side is the enemy, then you have to treat them as if they are an existential threat. And that's really what you see happening a lot on the right is you see the rhetoric that Trump and his allies and the broader MAGA movement resorting to is rhetoric about existential threats to American life. And that's the type of thing that can animate people to violence. If they think that the other side might come in and have a president that implements policies they don't like, that's one thing, right? They'll hold their tongue. But if they think the other side is going to come in and fundamentally reshape their lives in a way that's an existential danger, then they're willing to even take up arms. And, Victor, you and I have talked about this before. It sounds hyperbolic to say that the far right at the moment is becoming a domestic terrorist threat in this country. But if you just go look at the numbers, you see historic levels of people saying that they're willing to engage in civil war in the United States, that they're willing to secede from the Union. It's pretty shocking. The data shows that we are in a moment like no other, with the exception of perhaps the 1860s.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that we have elected officials like Marjorie Taylor Greene who openly call for secession and people who call for this kind of violence to be fomented. But I want to ask you maybe like a broader question, which is, as someone who's in this national security space and who studies these things more than I would assume the vast majority of the country, I mean, what is the scariest thing to you about the moment that we're in, or something that frightens you more than your time in government studying foreign threats?
Victor, it's really the vastness of it. It's that the numbers are now so high that it's really a game of probability in terms of when we're going to see acts of violence that are a result of this. We've certainly seen it. I mean, the attack at Nancy Pelosi's home, which could have represented a mortal threat, not just to her husband's life, but her life had she been there, is not a one off. That is very much a symptom of this broader climate of political intimidation and political violence that we're living in. And again, what worries me is that the numbers are so high. The chatter is off the charts. Now, when I went into government after 9/11 to work in national security, we thought the level of threats we were seeing against public officials and against the government apparatus was the highest in modern history. That term chatter became very popularized during that period because it was the best way that the FBI and CIA had to describe all of the threats they were tracking, which were just so frequent, it was very difficult to sift through it and figure out what was credible and what was not. What we are seeing now in terms of domestic terrorist threats, largely driven by the far right and by white supremacist groups and others, exceeds the level of chatter we saw in the years after.
I think we may have lost Miles Taylor for a moment, or that might be just on my end. Okay, so it seems like Miles Taylor may have cut out a little bit, but he was just talking about this national security threat and how kind of the moment where, oh, there we go.
You got me, Victor?
Yes, you're back.
Fantastic. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just saying that, the thing that is really jarring to me when you look at those numbers when it comes to the chatter, you see a surge in the number of cases that the FBI has. So let me give you an example. When I came into the executive branch again in 2017, it had been a number of years since I was back there. Roughly there were 1,000 domestic terrorism investigations in the United States, which was a huge number already. We'd seen domestic terror plots soar in the lead up to Donald Trump's presidency. By the time Trump left, that number had grown 400%. There was a 400% increase in the number of domestic terror plots that the FBI was tracking by the time Donald Trump left office. There was no better indicator of how that really violent political rhetoric was manifesting itself in people who were considering attacks. Now, again, to be clear, the FBI doesn't open cases in instances where someone has a strong political opinion. These are only cases where an individual might be planning an act of violence or something illegal. And we saw a surge in those cases during that presidency. To me, that's the best indicator of how big this threat has become. And I worry that there absolutely is the potential for something much bigger than January 6th. And we've seen that in other places. If you look around the world at the history of political violence and civil disorder, you largely find two things are the case. One, the conditions are right for widespread civil strife, and two, there's a spark. And right now, the conditions are unlike any other point we've seen in modern history in terms of popular dissatisfaction with government, favorable public attitudes towards attacks on government, and the concern is the spark. And we've seen a huge spike in assassination attempts against elected leaders and public officials.
I think Miles may have just left us once again. Sorry about this for the technical difficulties. I think we were just talking about, the assassination attempts and, oh, there we go. All good. I think you were talking about the assassination attempts and how that's kind of all on the rise and some of the conditions that are, or the sparks that are at play right now.
Yeah, and that's really the worry, I think, for national security officials is that an event like that could potentially trigger more widespread civil unrest. And that's right now what folks are monitoring is to make sure that plots like that aren't successful and don't create that spark. But the worry, of course, is you've got someone like Donald Trump who's back on the campaign trail, and the watchword for his campaign right now is retribution. it's
Mhm.
revenge. And that's something a lot of us had warned about in trying to take down Trump in 2020, is that if he was given a second shot, that would be the entire focus of his presidency in a second term, would be revenge and retribution against enemies. And, that may have sounded over the top to some people, but look, now Donald Trump is out there openly saying it himself. Is his goal, if he wins the presidency again, is revenge. And that type of attitude is the type that provides air cover and justification for groups that might engage in violent activity. And so I very much think it's a public safety threat. And I'll go a step further, Victor, and say I don't think there's any comparable point in American history where we have had someone, especially a former president, who poses an actual public safety and national security threat to the United States. But we do, and we're living through that for the first time, really in our country's history, with Donald Trump's attempt at winning the White House back.
That's really chilling. And so I guess that begs me to kind of ask you, I mean, what guardrails do you think should be in place to make sure that it doesn't result in the worst case scenario, which is, as we just said, violence? I mean, what should law enforcement officials be doing? What can all of us do to make sure that it doesn't end up reaching that point where we see another event like January 6th or even worse?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I'll commend the Biden administration for is that they've actually developed a domestic terrorism strategy. They've put resources behind it. During the Trump years, we couldn't get the White House to pay attention to issues related to domestic terrorism and the spike we were seeing. And the reason was because they didn't view violent extremist groups as threats. They viewed them as supporters. And that was a huge concern. It set the US government back years in terms of dealing with this threat holistically. Again, fortunately, the Biden administration has adjusted fire. They've put a lot of attention and resources behind this. They've developed a national strategy. But that still is insufficient to overcome the fact that you have an entire political movement that's providing the justification for some of this activity. So, what are the guardrails? Look, unfortunately, I think one of the best guardrails at the moment would be us seeing a rational faction emerge from within the Republican Party that smothers the MAGA faction that has embraced violence and political intimidation. Unfortunately, that guardrail appears to be as weak as ever. A lot of the so-called rational Republicans have been purged.
May have just lost Miles once more. Hopefully it's not my Wi-Fi. I think we should be okay. Sorry about that. There we go.
Victor, this one will go down as in history as the best start-stop conversation
Yes,
we've
exactly.
ever had.
Yes.
I'm going to blame New York cell phone towers
Yes.
for this, but I would say that we would hope that there would be a rational faction within the Republican Party. But if you go back and you look at the beginning of Donald Trump's term in office, of the moderate Republicans that were there, surveys have shown more than half of moderate Republicans that were elected officials at the start of Donald Trump's presidency are now gone from Washington. And that's because most of those people either resigned or they were defeated in primaries. So we have an increasingly radicalized, MAGA friendly Republican Party at the moment. So that puts that guardrail at risk. The other guardrails you can hope for are that certainly if Donald Trump wins the nomination, that the Democratic Party can defeat him. But also, we've got to do preparatory work to safeguard government institutions. And right now, Congress has a vanishingly small window to reinforce the power of whistleblower organizations in government, to place additional guardrails on the civil service, because Trump and his allies have made very clear that if they come back into power, their goal is to do widespread purges of the government civil service and install loyal lieutenants. That's extremely dangerous. There are things that the legislature can do to prevent that from happening. Unfortunately, though, we've got a MAGA-dominated Republican House of Representatives that is going to be anemic, or allergic rather, to undertaking those types of reforms. So, really right now, I think the voters are the last best line of defense against, a return of Trump and Trumpism. Even if Trump is not the nominee, though, again, my worry is that the party apparatus itself that I used to be a part of has now largely been overtaken with Trumpism and MAGA individuals. That in some cases, I even worry about a savvier successor to Trump, which is, Victor, as you mentioned, my book is called Blowback, a Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump, whether that's a second Trump administration or that savvier successor, because it's clear that whoever is atop the Republican Party is going to have to pander to the MAGA base to succeed.
Yeah.
And that means continuing to fan the flames of conspiracy theory and division.
Right. I mean, Trump might be gone, but Trumpism will still continue, it seems like. And my last question was actually for you to talk about your new book, which will come out in July. Talk to us, you mentioned kind of a brief synopsis, but why did you choose to write this book now in particular?
Well, look, I mean, I think there's the obvious reason and the not obvious reason. The obvious reason is I think we are at great risk of making this mistake again and giving Donald Trump a second term, or potentially enabling someone who has autocratic tendencies but is more polished to take the presidency. And what I wanted to do is paint a picture of what a second term would look like under a twice impeached, unconstrained commander in chief or a zealous understudy. And people don't have to take my word for it. I mean, in the book, I ended up interviewing close to 100 people that had served at the highest levels in the Trump administration or top Republicans in Washington in Congress to talk about what they projected would happen in the Justice Department, Defense Department, Department of Homeland Security, in the justice system under another Trump, so that we could have a very clear view of what to expect if we make that decision as a country. So that's the obvious thing I wanted to do, is paint the picture of what credibly could happen if America makes this mistake, so that people can engage in the political process very clear-eyed. And the not obvious thing that I wanted to write about is how more broadly as a country, not just our civic guardrails are weakening, but our own moral guardrails are weakening amidst this corrosive political environment. And it could cause us to make some very fatal civic mistakes in the long run. One of the people that I interviewed for the book, who had been deputy director of national intelligence under Trump, had a really good quote. She said, I project with low confidence that America reaches its 300th birthday in any recognizable form. That was a very sobering assessment to get from a leading intelligence professional. And that assessment was based off of some of the trend lines we are seeing in terms of political division in our country. So this is very much a warning. I encourage people to take a look. And like I said, don't take my word for it. A lot of the experts that I've spoken to from inside Trump's orbit paint a picture of what that second term would look like and why we as a country need to avoid it.
Well, I'm going to have you back on once you release that book, but save the title, save the date, July 18th, Blowback, a Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump. Miles, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and it was so fun to see you in a cab in New York City.
Thanks, Victor. I'll give you a little quick view. Here we are in the Big Apple. So thanks, my friend. Thanks for what you're doing, and Godspeed. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much, Miles. Well, it's always nice talking to Miles Taylor, who really is able to put things about our national security into some much needed context. So thank you, Miles. And again, check out his book, which will be coming out later this summer in July 18th. It'll be called Blowback, a Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump. And I think it's going to be a must read for everyone, especially young people, and just really anyone who's concerned about the future of our democracy. So thank you, Miles. Just a couple of things before I let you all proceed with your Wednesday. The first is I just want to, show my support for the Writers Guild of America. And I think, what they're doing right now, they're on strike not too far away from where I am, actually, in Los Angeles. They're really showing us kind of just the importance of paying workers. And a lot of the people, I mean, you have even people like Wanda Skies, Josh Gad, people who are in the industry now protesting with the Writers Guild. And they're doing such amazing work. And, every night you think of the entertainment that you get, you think of all the late night shows that is made possible only because of writers and the work that they do to, provide scripts, to provide monologues for people like Jimmy Kimmel or people like Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Fallon. So for all of them, I mean, this is a matter of, demanding better pay for better work. This is better, working conditions, and I support them wholeheartedly. I hope they reach an agreement because they deserve it. But if you haven't watched, I think the other day Stephen Colbert did this great segment at the end of his show, just thanking all of his writers and people who make the show possible. And it was a really touching moment where we sometimes forget about the people who are behind what we watch. And so for the foreseeable future, at least for maybe the next couple of days, the late night shows will not be airing. These workers and these writers will now be protesting. They're going to be protesting for better pay, better working conditions, and I stand with them. So thank you to all of the writers who are part of the Writers Guild, part of this union. They make the backbone of America. Thank you for all that you're doing, and I stand in support with you. One other thing I want to get into, yesterday night, there was a bombshell revelation by Abby Grossberg on CNN. And she basically said that back during the House speakership battle between Kevin McCarthy and other Republicans, basically Kevin McCarthy wanted to try to broker a deal with Tucker Carlson. He wanted to kind of try to do that on air. Tucker Carlson wanted to have on both Macy and McCarthy, who were both going to become speaker. And then McCarthy basically backed out at the last minute, but McCarthy still called Tucker Carlson and agreed to some of his terms in order to become speaker. And it's just, it's messed up on so many levels, but it's yet another reminder, I think, of why Kevin McCarthy is going to go down in history as the worst speaker in American history. It is just so unbelievable and, I guess unsurprising on many levels, but you just have to wonder, what are the other deals he made? We all know that he gave Tucker Carlson 41,000 hours of exclusive January 6 footage. We know that he gave Marjorie Taylor Greene and other right-wing Republicans some committee assignments. But what are the other things that Kevin McCarthy has done in order to become speaker, which is something that he's wanted all of his life? We don't know, but it seems like there's a lot that we don't know, and we deserve to know, because this is concerning for democracy. There should be no instance in which a speaker makes some sort of deal with a cable news host to become speaker. Just kind of let that sink in. To me, that was chilling, and Abby Grossberg, really, I think, provided that into context. And I think for everyone who wants to know what they can do, remember, every single person who is in Congress right now will be up for re-election, at least on the House side. So vote them out in 2024, because that's the only way that we can make sure they don't get more power. So that was something I found interesting. And just to Abby Grossberg, thank you for what you're doing. If you're listening, or if anyone who knows Abby Grossberg, pass that message along. She's doing great work just exposing Fox and everything that Tucker is doing. That's all the news I have for you today. Tomorrow we'll be back for another episode of On the Move. You're not going to want to miss that one. We'll be back every day at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 Eastern, right here on youtube.com/Politicon. And tomorrow we have an exciting episode with Representative Gloria Johnson from the Tennessee Three, who's going to talk about the Republican Party and the fascism, what's happening in state legislatures, and why all of us must pay attention and turn out to vote in 2024 on that down ballot races. So don't miss that. On Friday, we'll be joined by John Della Volpe, who will talk about some Gen Z stuff. So we have some exciting episodes for you in store. And of course, every day next week and the weeks after, we'll be back right here on youtube.com/Politicon. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And I will see you all tomorrow.